Let's go to the Americas now. We're joined by our correspondent in Mexico City, Katie Silva. Katie, Venezuela's former president, Nicolas Maduro, appeared in front of a US court today. What happened?
Yeah, it was quite striking seeing him and his wife, Celia Flores, appear in green khaki prison jumpsuits. They sat quietly, they listened to the proceedings through headphones that were live translated. There were two main takeaways. The first was the big question. The first big question mark was how the couple are going to fund their defence. So Maduro and his wife say that they don't have the funds to pay for their legal fees and that they want to use Venezuelan government money. But because both they and the government are subject to US sanctions, they needed to apply for a licence to allow the government of Venezuela to pay their legal fees. That was granted, then revoked. And prosecutors are saying that they shouldn't be able to use those funds because, according to them, Maduro plundered Venezuela's wealth and shouldn't be able to use that money for his legal fees. It did seem like the judge was relatively sympathetic to using those funds, saying basically that the right to defence is paramount and that otherwise, if they got, for example, a legal aid lawyer, they're unlikely to be versed in these sorts of geopolitical issues that they're going to be facing. The other thing to note that was quite interesting is basically we saw their lawyers asking the judge to dismiss the narco-terrorism case against them. So prosecutors have accused them of narco-terrorism. It was a law that was passed in the US about 20 or so years ago, designed to target drug traffickers who finance activities that the US considers terrorism. And he's accused of helping Colombia's FARC to move cocaine through Venezuela towards the United States. So that was part of it. We haven't yet seen them apply for bail, and so far they have been held since much earlier this year in Brooklyn's Federal Metropolitan Detention Center.
Meanwhile, as US-Cuba tensions escalate, it seems that Fidel Castro's brother has got involved in discussions between the two countries.
Yeah, so Raul Castro, he of course took over after Fidel Castro stepped down in 2008, and then he was president until 2018. We understand now he's involved in these talks that also include, of course, the current president Miguel Diaz-Canel and the United States. So Raul Castro, we saw him, for example, leading pretty historic talks with Barack Obama back in 2014. They were very successful. They led, of course, the reopening of embassies, the re-establishment of diplomatic relations. We've also heard from Canel Diaz telling local media that it's going to be a long process. President Trump recently, of course, saying that he's going to have the pleasure of taking Cuba soon. And, of course, we've seen Cuba come to the absolute brink. Nationwide blackouts. The defunct grid keeps failing. It's happened a couple of times this month already. And, of course, this ongoing blockade. And we've seen President Trump, for example, threatening tariffs on any country that sells fuel. Now, we understand a couple of tankers have been making their way from Russia, but, of course, Cuba really, really struggling. And so these talks, very, very important.
And Mexico's president has vowed she will continue to welcome doctors from Cuba, despite other countries dropping their agreements with the Cuban government recently. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Mexico has had very tight rope to walk. So whether to support, for example, this long-term ally or keep President Trump on side. It said, for example, that it stopped selling fuel earlier this year. But we have seen, for example, the sending of humanitarian aid just in the last few minutes. We have heard, though, Mexico saying that 2 of its Navy boats that were ferrying aid to Cuba are missing. But it wants to, as well, find ways to continue to support Cuba that aren't going to anger the US too much. So Cuban doctors have been a really interesting part of this whole equation. Cuba's medical system is top-notch, and it's had this long-standing program with other Latin American countries to basically export its doctors. It's meant to be a gesture of goodwill, and it provides Cuba with some money. Now, many have ditched their ties to Cuba's medical program, many countries here in the region, given that US pressure last month. For example, we saw the US passing a law that threatens sanctions on countries that continue to participate in the program. But today we're hearing, or just in the last couple of days, we're hearing Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum confirming that her country will continue to receive Cuban medical workers. She says it's hugely beneficial to Mexico that they basically go to rural, poor areas they have since 2022, and they go to places that Mexican doctors don't want to go to. But we have seen, for example, countries like the Bahamas, Honduras, Guatemala, all ending their participation in the program. And we also heard, for example, Marco Rubio saying that it was basically human trafficking. The United Nations, for its part, has raised concerns about why these passports are taken away from Cuban medical professionals. Havana says that it's to try and stop them from fleeing after they have completed their medical service.
Thank you, Katie. That is Katie Silva, our Americas correspondent, joining us live there from Mexico City.